Hi, this is Lynette Westendorf. I am a letter writer. I come by that behavior honestly and can still hear the sound of my father's old typewriter. I can see him sitting at the kitchen table, pondering his thoughts while writing. His letters often went to a newspaper, as do mine. It was my recent letter to the editor in the Methow Valley News that prompted Raven and Byron Odeon to invite me to write this essay for their YouTube channel, Methow Valley Speak Up. My letter to the editor challenged our local county commissioner, Andy Hover, to take a stand in regard to his fellow commissioner, Jim Detro, whose offensive, divisive, and cynical Facebook post made a joke of legal protesters in Minneapolis being harassed by a semi-truck. We should be accountable to one another for our behavior, whether as private citizens or public officials. Our commissioners are elected officials and should therefore be held to a higher standard of fairness and decency because they agree to represent all of us and because they are role models for young people. Raven and Byron are trying to initiate communication and understanding among people of differing political opinions, a virtuous and necessary challenge at this time of pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and many other African Americans at the hands of police. Recent protests spread far beyond America's borders to other countries who also share a violent history of colonialism. In Belgium, protesters tore down the statue of King Leopold II, well known for his brutal occupation of the Congo for rubber and ivory. In England, protesters threw the statue of the slaver Edward Colston into a canal. South Africa locked up the statue of Cecil Rhodes, the British founder of Rhodesia and imperialist who made his wealth in diamonds and large tracts of African soil. This movement for honesty and accountability is large and growing, but it is often challenging to know what to do close to home. How does that play out in our daily lives? For many years in my life, there has been an unwritten behavior at gatherings, dinners, and among friends and relatives to not talk about politics. It was the rule in my family growing up and has been ongoing. I think that has been a mistake. It has entrenched all of us in our views that we should let well enough alone and not make waves when it comes to how we think our country is doing. Refusing to engage in honest discussion allows us to enjoy our comfortable lives and let others deal with their own problems. It turns the we into the me, a backward solution. The mantra by which my father wrote his letters was the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. It's very simple. It substitutes the me for the we. I like to think that, given a real opportunity, all people will choose to do the right thing. We see that play out in emergencies where people rescue strangers and assist others who are in harm's way. But what if my optimism in humanity comes from my white privilege? What is white privilege? Many white people I know don't believe it exists. White privilege is the assumption that my life is representative of all lives when it comes to opportunity. My ancestors all came to America from Europe voluntarily. They were free to immigrate. Perhaps they never thought about the Native Americans whose land was taken for westward expansion. Once my great-grandparents were here, they had freedom to move and either take jobs or create their own work from the land. My maternal family moved from New Mexico to Oklahoma and Arkansas and to Idaho. My dad's ancestors came from Germany, settling in Iowa, then moving to Oregon and Idaho. All four of my grandparents bought land in Idaho. My parents had a public school education in the 1930s. My dad fought in World War II, and when he came home, he and my mom were part of the last homestead tract in the 1950s. They could borrow money. They could buy on credit. They could live free from prejudice of any kind. They worked hard and sent all three of their children to college. They took advantage of every honest opportunity offered to them, and we have all thrived, as have our children and now our grandchildren. White privilege is being the product of a colonial government who believed itself to be superior in every way to Black and brown people. Most of the country's founding fathers believed that Black people were incapable of taking care of themselves. They believed that Native Americans were uncivilized and needed to be converted to Christianity and trained in the manners of their conquerors. Our country's sacred documents, ostensibly written for all men, were really written for white males with property. My grandparents, born between the 1880s and 1906, could all have been children or grandchildren of slaves had they been Black. The American Civil War is very recent history. If you are over the age of 60, think about your grandparents. Imagine their grandparents being alive during slavery. Slavery didn't end in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. In Texas, slaves weren't freed for another 2 years. And just a decade before that, even in the northern states, it was basically illegal to be a free Black at all due to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed white vigilantes to accuse and capture any Black person in the North and send them to the South into slavery. Our white privilege does not have that in its history. Following the Civil War, racist white politicians, bankers, community participants, and the Ku Klux Klan began to systematically enact racism into our laws. Freed slaves were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule. Instead, white homesteaders got 160 acres, and Blacks were left to sharecropping, a feudal system at best. Black farmers couldn't benefit from banking, insurance, and freedom of vote. Black voters had to pay a poll tax. Policies of redlining forced Blacks to live in segregated communities with poorer schools, health care, transportation, and access to hospitals. Jim Crow laws in the South prevented freedom of movement and participation in public transportation, restaurants, drinking fountains, and even theaters. The great American composer Duke Ellington had to enter through the back door when performing in southern states. Alabama Governor George Wallace's famous quote was, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Freeways were built in cities intending to permanently keep communities separate. Our white privilege does not have that in its history. Throughout the South after the Civil War, monuments and statues were erected in honor of Confederate leaders, generals, and presidents. The Confederate flag, the strongest emblem this country has of slavery, was until recently flown proudly and openly on state and government buildings throughout the South. Any Black person walking down the street in front of a statue of Andrew Jackson or spending a $20 bill has reason to cringe. Our white privilege does not have that in its history. We all know of terrible violence against African Americans: lynching, the Tulsa Race Massacre, the Tuskegee experiments. We all know of the honors deserved, but not always given in the military. We all know that people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 due to living conditions, low-wage work, and poor health care. We all know the statistics of accusation, incarceration, sentencing, and violence in law enforcement against African Americans and other people of color. We know the names of Black men and women murdered by white civilians and law enforcement. I think that in spite of how far we have come in this country, until we deal with the inheritance of slavery, the absence of apology for slavery, the failure to enact reparation for slavery, and the inability of this country to correct the institutions of prejudice, including the history books used in schools, we of white privilege need to get out of our attitude of me and enter the realm of we, imagining ourselves in the shoes of a Black man or woman. These are the uncomfortable discussions we need to have with our friends and neighbors, families, and even strangers when the situation arises. Let us not assume our white privilege should protect us any longer.